The last four words of Nun Gimel Amid Beis, Tana Rabbanon. So we were talking yesterday how there are certain minchas, the Shtei Alechem and the Lachmei Toida, that have to be chametz. So we talked yesterday a little bit about how practically they would make it into chametz. So Tana Rabbanon, Ein machmitzim b'tapuchim, using apple cider, adding apple juice or apple cider, although it will begin to ferment it, that's not the type of fermentation that we're looking for. It won't make it the sourdough that we're looking for, and therefore you cannot use apples as a starter to make it chametz. Mishum Rav Chanina ben Gamliel Amar Machmitzin. Rav Chanina ben Gamliel says, why not? If you add apple juice or apple cider, whatever apple concentrate, it'll cause it to ferment. So why can't you use that as the starter? So it's a machlokes whether it's able to make it into chametz. Rav Kahana Masilo Rav Chanina ben Teradian, instead of Rav Chanina ben Gamliel, Rav Kahana changes the name to Rav Chanina ben Teradian. Now, it seems the machlokes is whether practically it will actually ferment it. Meaning, the Tanakama says that you can't use it because it won't actually ferment it, and Rav Chanina ben Teradian says it will. So it seems to be a machlokes practically mitzias. According to the Tanakama, you could add apple juice, it's not going to do anything. Here's the issue: Kiman Azla Hatanan, and who is the author of the next Mishnah? The Mishnah says Tapuach Sheriskan. If you crushed an apple of truma, you have an apple of truma. Yeah, you crush it, you turn it into apple juice or apple cider, whatever it is. V'nosub techaisa, and then you put it into a dough, and then the chimsa, and the dough rises because of it. Harezu asura. The halacha is that a non-kayin cannot eat it. Now, meaning, and what's the chiddush of this? Now, when truma gets mixed into non-truma, there's a shear that it's batel. Let's go, it's 1 in 100, right? 1 in 100, it's already batel. So that means that if it gets mixed in, I, as a non-kayin, if the amount of truma is so minuscule that it's nullified, I could eat it because it's batel. Except if, let's say, you add some yeast that's truma into a dough, it could be 1 in 500. It's going to be a problem. Why? Batel only applies when it's not recognizable. If you used it as a starter to leaven the bread, then it's not batel. That's the halacha in a lot of things, right? If you change the color of an item, then even if it's a small amount, it's not batel. So what does this Mishnah say? This Mishnah says that if you take apple cider and put it into dough, and then the dough rises because of it, it becomes chametz because of it, then a non-kayin can't eat it. It doesn't matter this year. Why? Because it rose because of it. And therefore you can't say it's batel. It could be 1 in 500. It's not batel. What do you mean batel? Batel means I can't see the effects. I see it's bread now. It's evident. It's clear. So what do you see though? You see that apple cider can cause it to rise. So there's a shayla in the Tanakama. I thought the Tanakama holds that it's not shayach. Over here it's clearly shayach. Says the Gemara, the answer is no. The truth is this could be authored by the Rabbanon. The answer is you misunderstood what the Chacham Shita is. The Chacham Shita is not that apple cider won't cause it to ferment. It's not true. Of course it will. It'll be Nechametz Nuksha, meaning it'll ferment 50%. Enough that for truma it's a problem. But if you want to have chashav bread to serve Hakadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis Hamikdash, we need better. So when the Tanakama was against it, he wasn't against it because he felt that apple cider is not a good starter because it won't ferment at all. It'll ferment. It won't taste as good. It won't ferment as properly as yeast. And therefore, while of course it'll ferment, it's not the type of fermentation that we're looking for. So if the law is the truma avada, it's not going to be batel. But for Shtei Alechem, you can't use it for the Shtei Alechem. Sort of, not really. That's what they're relying on. They're relying on that has nothing to do with chametz. That has to do with they're relying on that if it's only apple juice and no water, then it has to do it's possible of a kisnin. But that itself is a big shayla. Ravi Law ein loch hakasher lekmitza yoser meminchas choyte. Says Ravi Law, the hardest kmitza in the Beis Hamikdash was a minchas choyte. What's a minchas choyte? A sinner's mincha only with flour. There was no oil. See, normally you add oil to the flour, so it makes it like a little dough, a little pastish. So when you do kmitza, it's not that hard. The point of what makes kmitza difficult is that you need to have the amount, no less, no more. So you have to have the perfect amount that fills up these 3 fingers, no less and no more. Now, by the average kmitza, it's a little difficult because you have to rub it with your pinky and your thumb to make it perfect. but at least you deal with a paste. Paste is like, you can get a paste ball going. But minchas chayte is a sinner's mincha, it's just flour. You know how hard it is to have flour and to have none of it drop out from the top, drop out from the bottom, and none of it have two extra? That's very challenging. So Rabbi Lo says the hardest kmitza in the Beis HaMikdash was the sinner's mincha because it had no oil, so it was just flour. Says Rabbi Yitzchak bar Me'adimi, he says, I give you a good eitzah. Minchas chayte megavelos b'mayim ukshir. Add some water. Meaning, says Rabbi Yitzchak bar Me'adimi, the Torah said no oil, it didn't say no water. Add water to it. It'll invite to make a paste, and then the kmitza will be a lot easier. So who said, why is it chametz? Work it. Quick. Water doesn't make chametz. Water, an idol. Sitting in an idol makes it chametz. So add some water, and then that's it. Add some water. Why not? So the Yaveh Machlokes, the Tanakama, not the Tanakama, Rav Ilah mentions that there can't be water, can't be oil, so therefore it's the hardest. Comes Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dima, and he says, add some water. So what's the Machlokes about? So it says the Gemara, Lema b'hakam miflagi. Now this is a little bit what we spoke about yesterday. We're going to talk about it a lot today. Yesterday we had a little bit of an agav. If you have a change, we talked yesterday about the flour, the amount of flour. Is it the dough or the flour? Is it the raw ingredients or the wet ingredients? When you need an isaron, is that an isaron of flour, an isaron of dough? The Gemara says, perhaps the machlokes over here is as well. When the Torah says to do a kmitza, if I add water, why is it that Rav Ilah is against it? Perhaps Rav Ilah is against it because when the Torah says to do a kmitza, it means the way it was, meaning the flour. Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi says, no, the Torah is saying do the kmitza as it is now, which is as a dough. So the machlokes is when you have an ingredient that changed, flour to flour with water, do you need it to be the way it was? In which case, I can't do it anymore because there's water now. Or no, the way it is now is acceptable. Says the Gemara, Mar Savar Kamay Shehein Mesharin. Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi says that it's the way it is now, right now, and right now it's water, so that's fine. Mar Savar Kamay Shehayu Mesharin. And Rav Ilah says, no, it has to be the way it was. Flour, meaning not wet ingredients, dry ingredients. You add water, it's impossible to do it now. Because how could I do a kmitza on dry ingredients when there's water there? It affects everything. And therefore the machlokes is not whether you could add water. The machlokes is, does the kmitza have to be done on a dry material or even on a wet material? It says the Gemara, no. The truth is, loy. Dekuli alma kamay shehei mesharin. It could be that everyone agrees that when there's a change, you go by the way it is now. As we're going to see, there are situations where an item will change. And do you go by the way it was or the way it is now? It says the Gemara, no. Argument could be, everybody goes by the way it is now. So why is it that Rav Ilah is against adding water? I'll tell you why. Rav Ilah fundamentally feels that when the Torah says that a sinner's mincha is not allowed to have oil, it means no water either. It's pashut amachlekes. It has nothing to do with an ingredient that changed. You go by the way it was, you go by the way it is. It's not this big shaila. It's very simple. The Torah says a sinner's mincha cannot have oil. Does the Torah mean no water either, or no oil, but water is okay? Okay, so that's the Gemara. It's very simple. Dekuli alma kamay shehei mesharin ubakim ifli mar savar my chareva mishemen. Rav Yitzchak bar Dimi says that when the Torah says it should be dry, it doesn't mean actually dry. It just means dry from oil, but water is acceptable. Umar savar chareva mikol. And Rav Ilah says no, it has to be dry. A dry flour mamish, and water renders it invalid. So it's very simple. It's a machlokes about whether it's a very isolated machlokes of whether water is acceptable as an added ingredient to the minchas chayte. Okay, so we referenced this before, and we're going to talk about this now, and that is, it's going to take us basically to the end of the daf, and that is, if you have an ingredient that changed, do you go by the way it was or the way it is? I'll give you an example. You could take a steak, and it starts off very big, and then when you cook it, it shrinks. Or some items swell when they cook. So do you go by, there's a change. Do you go by the way it is or the way it was? Now this could be relevant in the following shaila. For food to transmit tumah, it has to be the size of a kebeya. Let's just for argument's sake say a kebeya is 5 ounces. I don't know if it is, it's not, whatever, 5 ounces. You have a food that was 5 ounces and then you cooked it and now it's less than 5 ounces. So now is it able to transmit tumah? If something's tummy, is it able to transmit to others? Well, it was a kebeya, but it's no longer a kebeya. Or vice versa. I have something that before I cooked, it was 4.5 ounces. Now after cooking, it's somehow swelled up to 6 ounces. So do you go by the way it was, in which case it was not able to transmit tumah, or the way it is, and it is able to transmit tumah? That's the fundamental shaila. Do you go by the way it was, or the way it is. Okay.
The same applies to just cooking, or are you talking about even if I have like dry flour and I add water to it, there's changes?
So
it gets bigger,
the Gemara is going to have a similar. So on
volume.
Amid Beis, the Gemara is going to discuss a similar shiloh if you have dried figs or fresh figs. Dried figs are about half the size, the volume of a fresh fig. So when you're figuring out meiser, I have some fresh and some dry. Do you go by volume? Do you go by numbers? And it's a similar shiloh. So it says the Gemara, Tanan Hasam, Basara Egel, if you have the meat of a young calf, Shenitzbach, apparently it swells when you cook. Young meat, tender meat swells, older meat becomes rubber and becomes smaller. So you have this change. So do you go by the way it is or the way it was? Again, that change could be that it was a kibeya and now it's no longer kibeya, or vice versa. The halacha is Meshayin l'kamei shehed. You go by as they were. Now, l'kamei shehed means as they were. But the question is, what does this Mishnah mean? This is a Mishnah. So it says the Gemara, it's machlokes. Rav v'Rav Chia v'Rav Yochanan Amri Mishtarin kamei shehein, as they are now. Kamei shehein means as they are now. I don't care what it was. Huh? Correct. They say that when the Mishnah says "lik kamei shehein," it means kamei shehein achshav. Achshav. That's that first opinion. Shmuel v'Rav Shimon b'Rabbi v'Reish Lakish Amri Mishtain lik kamei shehein, as it was. So there's two different versions of what the Mishnah means. Either it is as it is now, or as it was then. Again, that can create leniencies, that can create stringencies. So it's a machlokes. Says the Gemara, Meisa have a kasha. How are you supposed to read the Mishnah? So Meisa have a kasha. Basar ha'egel shaloi hayabay kashir. You have meat that was not a kibeya. Not a kibeya. V'tamach v'amad al kashir, and now it's a kibeya. So it was 4.5 ounces, now it's 5.5 ounces. So now it's the shear. Tahar l'sha avar. What it touched in the past is tahar because it was not the shear then. But timei mekan laba. Right now it's tameh. Meaning, you go by achshav. Achshav, it's the shear, so now it's able to transmit tuma. So this brisa clearly states you go by the way it is now, not the way it was then. So it's a shaila on the first opinions. How could Rav Chia and Rav Yochanan say that you go by the way it was? This brisa, is a shaila on the last opinion. Shmuel and Rav Shimon and Berebi and Rish Lakish say that you go by the way it were. This brisa clearly says that if it became the shear now, then now it's tameh, and not the way it was. You go by now. It's very clear. So it says the Gemara, midirabanan. They respond like this. Really, midiraisa, you don't go by the way it is now. It says it's tameh. That means midirabanan. Meaning, really, midiraisa, you go by the way it is, you go by the way it was. The way it was. And it's not able to transmit tumah. So why does it say tameh? Because now it's the shear, midirabanan. Okay, midirabanan, we're machmer. But me'ikra adin, we go by the way it was. Says the Gemara, wait. So you tell me it's a din derabanan? Ihachi, let's keep reading. Ema Seifa. What does the brisa say? V'chein bepigel, v'chein benoiser. The same halacha applies to pigel, and the same halacha applies to noiser. Now, what does that mean? Simple pshat of what that means is that if I have pigel, right? If you eat a certain amount, you eat kazayis a pigel chayv kares. I have a piece of meat that was not a kazayis, but now it's a kazayis. You eat it, now you're chayiv kares. So how could Rish Lakish say, that's just a din derabanan? Is chayiv kares derabanan? That's not derabanan talk. Pigel and noiser are not derabanans. Those are very, very deraisas. So how could you say that it's din derabanan? That's very deraisa talk. What is their derabanan pigel? There's no such thing as derabanan pigel. What are you talking about? So the answer is there is a derabanan pigel. You know what's the derabanan pigel? Tumah. Chazal created a tumah. All pigel is rabbinically tameh. Because Chazal basically, the Gemara explains that some Kehanim were a little bit corrupt, and they were purposefully ruining people's karbanos by making it pigel. So Chazal, corrupt. They were corrupt. They were bad people, and they were making people's pigel on purpose. So what Chazal did is they created a tumah of pigel so that the Kehanim would now be tameh, and that would actually prevent the Kehanim. They were willing to make it pigel, but they were not willing to make themselves tameh. So the point is like this. So when the Mishnah says pigel v'noiser, it's really, again, mid'oraisa, you go by the way it was. Mid'rabanan, and all the halachas the way it is now is only d'rabanan. It says v'chein lin and pigel that we go the way it is now. that's not real pigel. It's tumas pigel, which is derabanan. That you might think that because the tumas pigel the entire creation of tumas pigel is derabanan, therefore we don't go by the way it is now midirabanan. Kamashman you do. So Rish Lakish, it works out well. Really midiraisa you go by the way it was. Midirabanan we're machmir the way it is now. It's a chumr derabanan. Pigel and nicer also has a derabanan. What form? And that's tumas pigel and tumas nicer. The Gemara says Eima v'chein betumas pigel v'chein betumas nicer. So that the chamina hoyel v'tumas pigel v'tumas nicer derabanan he kuli hay derabanan liyav derabanan kamash v'lon. Okay, so that's how Rish Lakish is interpreting the Mishnah. They really midiraisa you go by the way it was, but we're machmir derabanan the way it is now. Here's the problem. Keep reading. Tashima, look at another brisa. Basar zakena shahaya by kashir. You have an old piece of meat that was the shear of a beya, v'tzamach pachas mikashir, and now it shriveled up, and now it's less than the shear. So it was the shear, and it's no longer the shear. So again, according to Rish Lakish, you go by the way it was, which means that it should still be able to transmit tumma. But what does the brisa say? Tam l'shavar tahar mekan laba. It is now tahar. It cannot transmit tumma anymore. So, and don't tell me. So how could Rish Lakish read this? And don't tell me that according to Rish Lakish, it's a chumrah derabanan. What do you mean chumrah? It's tahar. Meaning it was tameh. It was able to shear to transmit tumma, and now it's smaller. So says the brisa, well, it's no longer able to transmit tumma because you go by the way it is, not the way it was. And this is a kula. So how does Rish Lakish interpret this? It's a problem. So says the Gemara, you're right. Amar Rabba, so Rabba reinterprets the machlokes, and he says like this. Everyone agrees if it was the shear and it's no longer the shear, it's no longer the shear. Meaning, so everyone agrees if it was and now it is not, it is not. That everyone agrees to. And everyone agrees that if it was the shear, if it was not the correct shear and now it is, we're machmir derabanan. Everyone agrees again. So if it was and it is not, it is not. If it was not and it is derabanan. Everyone agrees to all this. Go to the next page. Keep ligi. What's the machlokes? The machlokes between these amarayim is a very specific case. Kegon shahaya by kashir, v'tzamak v'chazer v'tafach. It was the shear. It got smaller. It was not the shear, and then it re-swelled up. It was not. It is. That's the specific case. You go the full gambit of shear, not the shear, shear. That's the machlokes. And what is the machlokes about? The machlokes is that if you have an isser, or in this case a tumah, that at one point lost its shear status, can it ever get it back? That's the machlokes. The Gemara says, the mar savar yesh dichoy bi'isura, umar savar ein dichoy bi'isura. One opinion says that there's dichoy bi'isura, which means that if an isser it lost its status of an isser, it can never get its status back. And the other opinion disagrees. So the machlokes is very simple. If it just went one directional, it was and then it's not, or it's not and then it was. If it was the shear and then it's not the shear, it's not the shear anymore. If it was not the shear and it is derabanan, and everyone agrees to this. The machlokes is where it was not, and then it is again. The question is there a concept to call dichoy? Dichoy means that once it lost its status, the isser is gone. By the way, there's some place can actually take the Zakutinsky mamish so far that if I have chazer, then it becomes inedible, and then it becomes edible again. It's not usher to eat it, because at that moment it went that way. Once it becomes inedible, it loses the status of the isser. Even edible again won't go again. This was the gelatin shiloh, the famous gelatin shiloh, huh? It's Chazon Ichaskel. He might have quoted Chaim Mezer. I wasn't known to be the Chazon Ichaskel, but could be Chaim Mezer also. I don't know. So that was the famous shaila, because you have gelatin which starts from pig, but then it goes through the process and it becomes inedible, and then they make it edible again. And the question is, dichoy be'isurim or not? Says the Gemara, we'll just end the discussion with this. Is there such a possibility that if the Isser goes from the flow where it was an Isser, it's no longer an Isser, and it's back to being an Isser, that the Isser is gone? There's such an opinion. Look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah basically says outright now like this. The Mishnah says, you have an egg volume of tamei food. Egg volume of tamei food that you place in the sun, and it shrank. So it was the shear, and now it shrank. V'chein kazayis min ames, or a kazayis of a human corpse. Kazayis min an avela, kadasha min asher. It's all the shear. Kazayis pigol, kazayis noiser, kazayis chaylev. All of the shear, yeah. So you have a kazayis of a piece of a dead body that shrivels, and now it's no longer kazayis, tahirin. It's tahir. Okay. But then what does the Mishnah say? But if it rains again and it swells back, so it went from the shear, less than the shear, back to the shear, all the Isurim come back, and it's chayiv mishum pigel, noiser v'tamei, and it's all tamei and all that stuff. So you see that it goes from the shear to not the shear, back to the shear, it's aser. Tiyufta, l'madamar, yeshticha, b'Isurim, tiyufta. Very good. So here until the end of the daf, it's going to be a few minutes. It's not tricky, but it's basically like this. Let me explain. When it comes to, we separate different things. Truma is separated. Truma has a volume. Truma is like this. It is a scale. You don't have to be very specific with truma. You give a kayin either a 40th, a 50th, or a 60th. That's it. So it's a wide range. That's what I'm looking for. There's a wide range. Meiser is not like that. As we're going to see in a moment, you have to give a 10th. No less, no more, by the way. As we're going to see, people don't realize this. I'm not talking about Meiser money. That's a minig. I'm talking about Meiser to the Levi. If you give 20% to the Levi, that's a problem. You wouldn't think it's a problem. It's a problem. I'll explain in a moment why. So the Gemara is going to have the following discussion. I have in front of me dried figs and fresh figs. And I want to separate, seemingly we're talking about Meiser. How do I do that? Because I have to be able to take off a 10th, no more, no less. And the problem is, dried are not the same size as fresh. They were, right? Obviously, I have 10 figs in front of me. Half I dried, half I didn't. Obviously, they all started the same plump, fresh figs. But now, I got half of them are dried, and half of them are fresh. How do I separate Meiser? That's the good discussion of the Gemara. It says Gemara Tashema, Tarmin. Now, while it says Tarmin, we're going to translate as Meiser. So you're separating Meiser, Te'inim ala Gregoris. I'm separating fresh figs for dried figs. How do I do this? You do it b'minyan. You do it by numbers, not by volume. You do it by numbers, meaning you count out 10 and you take every fresh fig, and that works for the other 9. Now, the problem with that is, think about this for a second. I got 10 figs in front of me. Make it easy. I got 9 dry and 1 fresh. The halach is just take out 1 fresh and you're good to go. Why is that work? Because now, if you believe that you go by the way things were, well, they were all fresh at one point. Perfect. We look at them as if they're all fresh. They're all the same volume. We look at it as if they're all the same. Take off 1 and you're good. But if you go by the way that things are right now, the dried are half the size of the fresh. In essence, what I did was I took off about 15 to 20% as opposed to 10%. If you told me how to fix it the way it is now, I would say you can't go by numbers, you go by volume. Because if you take a fresh one for the other 9, and the fresh one is basically double the size of a dried fig, I took off not 10%, I took off basically almost 20%.
But it's not only that, every day it's going to change.
I don't care about every day. I'm talking about right today. I'm living in the moment. I live in the moment. So I take it off, right? Problem is, if you go by the way things were shown, it makes sense. But if you go by the way things are, you're taking 20%. How should you do it? If you go by the way things are, you should go by volume. You should measure it out. Every 10 pounds, take off a pound. That's how I would do it. You say, no. Take every 10 figs, take off a fresh fig. The problem is the fresh fig is bigger than the dried figs. So in essence, I'm taking off 20%. So you say to yourself, who cares if you take off 20%? Why is this a big deal? I'll tell you why. It's counterintuitive. I wouldn't have thought this because you think you should be generous. If you take off a fresh fig, make it simple. Forget about dry, fresh. I have 5 figs in front of me, so what should I do? I should take a fig, cut in half, and give it to the Levi. I just decide, give him the whole thing. I'm feeling super generous. The reason why it doesn't work is because only half of that fig is actually meiser. The other half remains tevel. It's unfixed. And because I can't identify which half, meaning Chazal made it that only half of that fig is considered meiser, the other half is considered tevel, and because I don't know which half, the Levi can't eat that fig. You give him a fig, he won't be able to consume it.
Why does he think that?
Because Meiser only works on half of it. Only half of it is actually Meiser. The other half is sort of excluded from the proceedings. It remains to the Tevel because it was never fixed. And therefore only half of it is Meiser, half of it is Tevel, but the Levi doesn't know which half, so he can't eat it. So you can't go above and beyond. You got to go 10% by Meiser. Now, you could go above and beyond by Truma. You want to give a Kayan 40%, a 20%, a 40th, a 50th, a 60th, that's fine. Truma is much more fluid. Meiser is not. So says the Gemara, you don't go by volume, you take every tenth and hand it to the Levi. Says the Gemara, now, if you go by the way things were, well, the way things were, they were all fresh at one point. Then Shapir, then it works out. But if you assess the items the way they are right now the fresh is double the size of the dry. So in essence, you're giving more than 10%. Havale marba b'maisris, you're giving more than 10%. And the halach is v'tanya, ha-marba b'maisris, if you give more than 10%, pay roisav mitukin. The rest of the pile is fixed, but hamaisus of mikukalin. But that which you give the Levi is messed up because only part of that is meiser and the other part is tevel, and the Levi won't be able to consume it. So therefore, the fact that we're saying just give a 10%, give a tenth. Literally every 10 fruit, just separate one. That only works if you go by the way things were. So says the Gemara, it's a raya that you go by the way things were. Here's the issue. Perfect. Okay, you go by the way things were. And dry and fresh, they were all fresh at one point. Perfect. Here's the problem. You go by the way things were. Keep reading Amos Seifa. The problem is the opposite. If I have 1 dry and 9 fresh, you know what the halacha is? Again, you just told me to go by the way things were. The way things were, they were all fresh. You should take off number 1 out of 10, hand it to him, right? If you're telling me you go by the way things were, then dry and fresh figs are all fresh. But what does the Brisa say? In the reverse case, where I'm separating the dry for the fresh, you then go by volume. You go by volume, you don't go by numbers, you go by poundage. You figure out how much pounds are. So let's say I have 10 pounds of figs, I separate 1 pound of dry figs. Now that only works if you go by the way things are. You understand the problem. The first case, where you're separating fresh figs, we say, just take off 1 out of 10. That only works if you go by the way things were. The way things were, they were all fresh. Makes sense. But then the Brisa says, but if you're separating dry, you got to go by volume, you got to go by weight. Well, going by weight only works if you go by the way things are now. So the first part, you go by the way things were, but now you're going by the way things are. You see, if you go by the way things were in the end, I have 10 pounds. Again, I have 10 pounds, 1 pound of dry figs, 9 pounds of fresh figs. If you go by the way things were, they're all fresh. Take off 1 out of 10. You don't go by weight. Take off 1 out of 10. But now you're saying, no. Take off a poundage. Do you know how much a pound of dry figs are? It's basically 2 pounds of fresh figs. So if you're telling me to go by the way things were, I'm now giving more than I need to. That's the problem. It's like both cases, you're not being consistent in you go by the way things were or the way things are, but you're making me give 20% in both. In the first case, I'm taking off 1 fresh for every 9 dry. That's 20%. In the second case, I'm taking a pound of dry figs for every 10 pounds of fresh figs. That's also 20%. And you're being inconsistent. And you're making me give 20% in both cases. So what's going on? Says the Gemara, Lamai K'moshe and Imaseifa. Greg Risaltin Mida, Yamrit B'Shloima, K'moshe and Shapir, El Yamrit K'moshe Hein, Marb Meisus Hey. I'm being Marb in both cases. And you're being inconsistent. You know what the answer is? Says the Gemara, we're not talking about Meiser. The answer is very simple. We're not talking about Meiser at all. We're talking about Truma. We never said the word Meiser. I told you Meiser. I was lying. I was tricking with you guys. It's not Meiser. It's Truma. We're talking about Truma. Now Truma... Okay, Truma, there's a scale. So you know what the answer is? We're talking about Truma, and you have a situation where you're fresh and dry. We're not sure, do you go by the way things are? You go by the way things were? You know what the answer is? Be machmer. Truma, you could always give too much. Give 20% when you're separating the fresh. Give 20% when you're separating the dry. Easy. If it's Truma, it's not a shaila. If you ask a rabbi by Truma, and he say, listen, it was, but now it isn't. It was dry. It was fresh. Now it's dry. What do I do? You know what the rabbi will say? It's Truma. Just give extra. What do I care? Don't bother me. If it's mice, you got to be very specific. But Truma, go ahead. Because Meiser is 1 out of 10. But Truma, the pasuk describes it as give a percentage, give a amount. It doesn't say the specific amount. So we say a 40th, 50th, a 60th. There's more of a range. You could give machmer. So it says the Gemara, Hacha b'Truma gedoyla askinon, v'reisha b'ayin yafa, v'seifa b'ayin yafa. We just want you to give generously. Here's the issue. We'll end with this. You tell me it's Truma. The problem is the Brisa says to give 1 out of 10. 1 out of 10 is, if I were to ask you, is that Truma jargon or Meiser jargon? You don't give 1 out of 10 for Truma. It's a 40th, a 50th, or 60th. It's 2%. It's not 10%. 1 out of 10 is Meiser talk. So don't tell me we're talking about Truma. It says 1 out of 10. It says the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi said, my father used to take 10 dried figs for 90 fresh figs. Again, we'll figure out the ratio. He would take 10 dry for 90 fresh. That was his ratio. Now that is not Truma talk. That's Meiser talk. That's 10%, but it's actually like 10%. It's more than 9%, but it's not Truma talk. Says the Gemara, meaning he would actually use the number method. It's the same. He would just use the number, not the volume. He always went by number, not volume. The point is, though, that's Meiser talk, not Truma talk. Truma Gedoyla, if you're talking about Truma Gedoyla, what is he talking about? 10%. That's 10%. That he would take 10 dried figs for every 90 figs. Meaning he would have 90, he would take out 10. It's a little bit more than 10%. We'll figure out why tomorrow. But the point is, that's not Truma talk, that's Meiser talk. So you know what the answer is? It's both. How does it Truma and Meiser? The halacha is that when you give Meiser to the Levi, he has to take some of it, he has to take 10% and give it to the Kohen. That 10% that he gives to the Kohen can be given generously. That's the one case where you can have 10% be given generously. Because it's not 10% to the Levi. It's when you give 10% to the Levi, he has to give 10% to the Kohen. That's called Trumas Meiser. But that Trumas Meiser can be given generously. And that's what we're talking about. The answer is, Halcha b'Trumas Meiser Eskina. We're not talking about Meiser, we're not talking about Truma, we're talking about Trumas Meiser. That's the 10% that the Levi has to give from his Meiser to the Kohen. And who holds that can be given generously? Because you could argue that maybe has to also be exactly 10%, no more, no less. The answer is, it's Abba Elazar ben Goimel, who, if follows the Shita Abba Elazar ben Goimel, who says that it can be given generously. The Tanya, Abba Elazar ben Goimel Oimer, V'nechshav lechem Trumaschem is plural, but straight Trumas Akasav V'daber, Achad Trum Gedol, Achad Trumas Meiser. This is the allusion to Trumas Meiser, because there's 2 Trumas. You give to the Kohen, and then the Levi gives from what you gave him to the Kohen as well. And the pasuk says, "Kashem shetruma gedayla nitela ba'omer umachshava," and just like regular truma can be given by thought alone without physically separating it, and it can be given by estimation. I mean, it doesn't have to be mamish b'diuk 10%. You estimate it by truma. Kach trumas meiser nitela ba'omer umachshava. When ma truma gedayla ba'ayin yafa, af trumas meiser ba'ayin yafa. And just like truma gedayla can be given generously, you can give more than necessary. So trumas meiser as well. All right, we'll stop here.